to Onshape Orientation. Today we're going to be talking about constraints. And so basically what constraints are a set of rules for your sketch geometry. So dimensioning is a most basic type of rule, and we've gone over that. Dimensions, angles, that kind of stuff. But now we're going to make sure things have relationships and rules. And the first one we're going to talk about today is coincident or coincident. So let's get started with a sketch on the top plane. Hold Shift S and press N and P to hide those planes and to normalize your view. If we look next to dimension, after this, before the search bar, all the things between dimension and the search tools is our constraints. So our first one, we'll look over coincident. Make two or more sketch entities share the same location in a sketch by pressing the letter I for your shortcut key. This is one you use a lot, so get used to that letter I shortcut key. So in order to use this, we need to have some geometry. So I'm going to start with a rectangle that is 2 wide by 3 tall. Notice because I started from the origin and gave it 2 dimensions, it is fully defined, and we denote that by turning solid black versus blue lines. I'm also going to draw another rectangle over here that is not dimensioned, and you'll see that because there's no dimensions on it and there's no constraints tying it to each other or relation to something that's snapped into place, it's not fully defined. So what we're going to do is I want this top right corner of my fully defined rectangle and the bottom left corner of my rectangle that is not fully defined to coincide with one another. So I'm going to press the letter I, or I can click up here again on the toolbar. I'm going to click the top right corner of my defined, and I'm going to click the bottom left corner of my undefined, and you'll see that we get the line. Those 2 points now coincide. They exist in the same location. You'll see too, because I did that, because we're tied to the origin and we have dimensions, that these 2 bottom lines now are fully defined. They would need some dimensions. We're going to have to give them some sort of dimension, but you'll see that it's defined in a way that it knows that it's tied to that anchor point, right? So if I were to come in now and use dimension and I said, hey, this needs to be 10 inches, it's going to push 10 inches from the left over, right? I'm going to undo this and let this kind of float. If you define it beforehand and say this needs to be 5 inches tall, okay, we'll zoom out a little bit, and I coincide those same 2 corners, you'll see that now it shrinks. It'll scale both sides down and move it accordingly, and give it a bit different of a measurement, right? If I were to give both sides of this a dimension, we'll make this 5 by 4. You'll notice it's still not fully defined because it is blue, but now I can coincide this corner, and essentially it's just going to shift my geometry where I need it to be. So coincident is a very cool tool. Most of the time you're going to be using it to tie some objects together. But let's show this with a little bit different lines. So now, instead of using rectangles, let's use this line feature. I'm going to draw a line here, draw a line here, and draw a line here. So none of these are touching, but we want to make a closed polygon. So a couple of things you can do. Some people will probably get in the habit of doing this and press I. The problem is they're going to coincide all on the same angle of that first line that I picked, and that's not what we want to do. So if this happens to you, you're like, I swear I did the steps. This is probably what happened. So we'll undo that. I need this point and this point to coincide with one another. Now, because I picked the left one first, the right line is going to move to the left line. So if I click here and I click this one needs to move to this one, that line moves up to that like we need to, okay? Now this is where things get a little tricky. Everybody's probably been watching the dimension video and you guys are used to giving everything dimensions, right? So if I were to come in here and say this needs to be exactly 10 inches, this needs to be an angle of 55. This needs to be, we'll leave that at 76.12. And then I come and tell these 2 points to coincide. It's going to move this one shorter, and it's going to extend this one out. So I had some questions in some comments earlier about, I use QCAD or I use TurboCAD or some other version of some, maybe FreeCAD, whatever you use. And they're like, this feature exists in there. Does that exist in Onshape? And the answer, I guess, is yes and no. Yes, you can do similar things, but there's not a specific action. The question I got in particular was for the meet two lines feature. And essentially, that's what we just did. I want this line and this line to meet, right? And so instead of a meet two lines, it's a coincide. So I want this point and this point to coincide and make that geometry work however it needs to, okay? If we undo that, the trouble you get into is if everything has a measurement. So if this is supposed to be 15 and this is supposed to be 8, let's say, and now I say coincide, it blows up and turns red. It doesn't like it, right? So pay attention to what you actually want out of the sketch, right? We can't have all these rules be active at once. I tell the kids when we go over this, why does your sketch turn red? And I'll give them this example. I say, put your right hand on the right wall of our shop and take your left hand and put it on the left wall of the shop, right? And they're like, well, I can't do it. And I said, well, why? What's holding you back? And they're like, well, my arms are too short. And I said, oh, so that's the rule that's already there. So the shop might be 40 feet across from wall to wall, but the rule that is designating whether you can stretch your arms out or not is how long your wingspan is or how far out your hands can go, right? I can put my hand on one wall and have my arms fully outstretched, and I can have one hand on the other wall and have it fully outstretched, but I can't have my arms fully outstretched and touch both walls. So if you look at this, when you get a sketch like this, something needs to be deleted. So what I could do is come up here to my sketch and click the Show Constraints box, and you'll see that it's going to show me all the things that are tying it up, as well as my dimensions, which are already up. If I delete one of them, it'll make this geometry work. So if I delete this 10 and say, hey, I don't want that to be 10 anymore, okay, that's not what's going to save it. It's probably going to be one of my angles. So if I delete my angle and I delete my 8-inch line dimension, it'll now change that accordingly, right? If I know that those measurements are right, it needs to be a 15, 10, 8, then both angles need to be deleted, and that's how you get that. So if we were to go measure angles now, we would have different sets of angles. So keep that in mind when you're using the coincide tool. If you've already fully defined and given it a bunch of geometry, it's going to kind of tweak and freak out. And I have students, adults and kids alike, that are always like, oh my God, I don't know what happened. It turned red. Okay, what was the last thing you did? That's probably the thing that made it mad. Let's go and fix it. And if there's something else, if you know you need to have that constraint or that dimension, well, there's something else along the way that got messed up. For example, I've had kids do this all the time. In one of my first practice drawings we do, they'll draw a line, make it 2 inches, and then draw another line, go down and make it 2 inches, right? And if you notice, is as we go, you're like, well, I've never done constraints before. If you notice, as I'm drawing right now, it wants to throw that perpendicular constraint on there because that's what it's doing, right? It's perpendicular to that line. It's snapping into place. So we'll do this, and they'll come up to the top and they'll finish this final square and then say 2 inches, and they're like, yep, enter 2 inches. That's exactly what I want. And then it blows up and it turns red, and it's like, oh, I don't know what's going on. There's too many rules you're giving it, okay? So a couple of things I could do. I can come in and delete that single dimension, and it'll be fine. Because we know, one, if the top is 2 of a square, the bottom also has to be 2. If the height is 2, then the other side wall has to also be 2, right? if I were to go in and make this 3, we don't have a square anymore. And then this changes as well. So if I give it too many dimensions, it can also start to freak out. You can over constrain and over define your geometry. So just a couple of things to pay attention to. Now, where would I use this, right? I'm a big firm believer in you learn a skill and you learn a tool, but what's the point? Is it worth anything? Is it good, right? So I have this example of a part you might make, right? So I have 2 rectangles with exactly the same geometry. You'll see I have a 10 by 36. I'll move this up here. With a line down the center that is 33 inches long and 5 inches from the top. And 5 inches from the bottom as well, for that matter. If we look, and I turn my constraints on, my bottom line, or my bottom shape, my bottom rectangle, has that line with a midpoint constraint and has a lot more constraints attached to it, but it has less definitions and dimensions applied to it, right? My top one has a 5. While this doesn't have a midpoint, it is lined up with the midpoint being that 5-inch dimension. But what we kind of did here was we tried to future-proof this, right? I also didn't give it this 33-inch measurement on my bottom one here. So what I mean by future-proofing is, let's say we're going to add some slots here really quick. So I need these lines to be the geometry for the slot. We're going to do let's do a 3-inch slot on both of these. Okay. And on this bottom one, I'm going to tell these points to coincide here. But I'm not going to do it on the top one. Boss comes in and says, hey, this part, I'm glad you made it. Looks good, works really good. I like that 3-inch spacing from the side, but the whole overall part actually needs to be not 3 feet, it needs to be 4 feet. So instead of 36 inches, it needs to be 48 inches. No big deal. Pop back into Onshape, double click that. And now my bottom one, since it was fully constrained, fully defined, it's ready to go. All I had to do was change that measurement and I'm good to extrude and move on. Top one, change the drawing. And now I have to go in and add the constraints after the fact. So now I'd have to go in and say, hey, those need to constrain. Oh, what's going on? It turned red. I'm giving it too many rules because it wasn't aligned when I first did it. So I could make this point coincide with this line. And it's still gonna, right? So I'd have to go through and figure out why certain things are the way they are. It doesn't seem to like this. I think there's too many points added or whatever. But if you draw it with the constraints in mind as you're going, editing later won't take as long to master and to get the final product like you want, right? So that's going to do it for us today for the constraints for coincident. I will move on next week and we'll go to the concentric tool, which is pretty much coincident, but for circles, center points, and whatever. I think I like this doing it one by one. Let me know if you'd rather have like a big video with, multiple constraints put in one. I feel like this is a way where you can use it as a reference source. So again, keep reaching out. I know there's a couple of you guys that have found me through Facebook or whatever, through some of the Onshape groups. Keep on keeping on and ask all the questions. That's the only way you're going to get better. But that's going to do it for us tonight. Thanks again. If you have any comments or anything for future videos, let us know. Other than that, I'll see you guys later.